Okay. Jordan, it's good to see you. Roger, very good to have you here. We're going to proceed in Jewish time, so we're going to let the Zoom populate for a few more seconds. Roger, I understand you were just out in Simi Valley. You were out in California.
Yeah, we just held our 12th Reagan National Defense Forum.
How'd it go?
It went well by all the metrics. We pay attention, great participation, good coverage, excellent speakers. We had the Secretary of War there, which he hasn't made many speaking events outside of sort of narrow pockets. So that was a thing, Brett.
I am pleased to hear that, and I'm pleased to know that that the survivors remained unshot in this case.
Well, there's a lot of firing.
That was probably a terrible joke on my part. I retract it. All right, let's get started. Okay. Jordan Hirsch, Roger Zakheim, thank you very much for joining this this SAPIR conversation, this podcast. The reason we have you both here is a difference, a powerful, but I think a very intriguing and productive difference of opinion. Jordan Hirsch, whose principal distinction is that he was many years ago my intern. Later went on to do a few things here and there at Yale Law School, and then of course now as a senior counselor to the head of Palantir, one of the most dynamic businesses in America today. Jordan has written an extraordinarily learned, provocative, stimulating, intriguing essay in our latest issue of SAPIR, which is the money issue. It's called "The Need for a Jewish Sovereign Wealth Fund." And I'm going to let Jordan briefly unpack the argument that he makes there. But not everyone was on board with Jordan's argument, not least Roger Zakheim of the Ronald Reagan Institute, the Washington director of the Institute, who wrote a rebuttal, which we have which we published a few weeks ago on our website, taking respectful but extremely robust and systematic exception to the core points of Jordan's call for a sovereign Jewish wealth fund. So, Jordan, just for the benefit of our audience, which has not yet had the chance to read your essay, excuse me, why don't you just unpack in a couple of minutes what the core of your case is for a sovereign wealth fund?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for arranging this, Brett, and for the honor to publish in SAPIR. It's really a pleasure and wonderful to be among such great contributors to the most recent issue, which is getting good wear in my talus bag on our way to in shul. So anyone who hasn't read it yet, sorry, rabbis, that's a great place to pick it up. Just to begin with the argument, what I was trying to grapple with in the piece is what I think many American Jews are feeling now, which is a sea change in life for American Jews, that the golden age of American Jewry is coming to an end. We can all feel the tremors of that in some way, shape, or form, no matter what our politics are, whether you're from the left, or the right, the center, or you're homeless or in between. My diagnosis for what's happening here is that American Jews have become like gargoyles. They are attached and beautifully attached to the parapets of institutions that are crumbling in America. We live now in a low trust society where the very things that the American Jewish community supported in order to secure its place in America and to show its gratitude for the blessings of being welcomed in the United States, those institutions are falling apart. And American Jews are caught in the crosshairs of that problem. And what I try to set up in the piece is historical understanding of what the Jewish community attempted to do in America, which I argue is a very largely scaled version of Stadlanut. Stadlanut is the Yiddish term for intercession. And historically speaking, in the diaspora, the Jewish community relied on very talented or resourceful members of the community to intercede with, to lobby basically the court, wherever that may be. It could have been in Germany, it could have been in Baghdad, it could have been in Spain, it could have been in Italy. This practice was widespread. It was widespread in Ashkenazi and Sephardic lands where Jews lived. And it relied basically on trading Jewish success and material resources and wherewithal in exchange for rights, which were not automatically recognized. Now, the American context looks very, very different on the surface. Obviously, we're much more welcomed here in America than we have been in any other country, historically speaking. There are many blessings to the American democracy that Roger, I think, quite rightly expounds on in his response to my essay. But I would argue that what we have done here is take Stadlanut and expand it at a scale that's really unprecedented, but it's effectively the same thing. We've taken the institutions of the land, which is to say Congress, for example, or the State Department, and we built mirroring institutions. So instead of having one person represent the Jewish community, it's an entire set of institutions that represent us in front of the United States and the broader public. And I argued that as a result, we've become very entrenched with ideas of institutionalism at exactly the time when those institutions are falling apart. And the reason why I make that case is it's an attempt to understand why the sudden spike in anti-Jewish hatred, especially online, especially in highly progressive or highly right-wing circles, what people are calling the woke right. What explains all of that? And I think the uniting factor in those two sides is an anti-institutionalism, which the Jews are become central players in because we are so bound up in those institutions which people no longer trust. The argument I make, which we can get to, is that the answer to this is to adopt something like a Jewish sovereign wealth fund, to adopt a whole new set of tactics in engaging with American society.
So sovereign wealth funds, as most of us know them, are gigantic government owned and led investment vehicles from countries like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, which are in the business of purchasing, Formula One events or golfing events. They're enrichment schemes or mechanisms for sovereign countries. Explain for a second how that might work in the American context, where obviously there is Jewish sovereignty. It just happens to be in Israel. But how would it work here? And would it, in fact, relieve the anti-Semitic tide if all of a sudden, in place of, say, the American Jewish Committee or all the other alphabet soups of organizations, you suddenly had a multi-billion-dollar fund of money coming from fabulously well-to-do Jews supporting specifically Jewish causes, as opposed to the traditional mechanisms of Jewish philanthropy, which to some extent go to Jewish causes, in other ways fund, hospitals and research institutions and other gifts to America beyond the purely Jewish interest. Doesn't that do more to accentuate or accentuate an anti-Semitic stereotype rather than relieve it?
Yeah. So to your first question, how would it work? I think a very interesting way to start would be if a group of Jewish financiers got together and invested in bringing, let's say, TNT manufacturing back to the United States. We don't make any TNT explosive in the United States anymore for a whole.
I think we just blew up the last factory in Tennessee.
Yeah. Right. So we get it all from Poland.
Someone blew it up.
Someone blew it up. Right. Someone blew it up. We get it all from Poland, which is highly problematic for a number of reasons. First and foremost, Poland is in a very dangerous part of the world now. And we need some of that TNT. And wouldn't it be nice if the Jewish community could say, we are responsible for bringing this back to the United States, reindustrializing the country, bringing back American jobs. That is the kind of purchase that I think the community needs. And I don't think it would actually require $1 trillion wealth fund to be able to do something like that. But to the question of whether this would increase anti-Semitism, I think we're already getting blamed for having all the money anyway. So what benefit are we getting out of it by not spending it wisely? My argument here is that the constituency that the Jewish community needs to reach isn't the people suffering from what I call in the piece Jewish derangement syndrome, which are people that are, obsessed with Jews. They think about them all day, every day, and they hate them qua Jews. What I'm interested in are the people who are anti-institutionalists, who are therefore more skeptical of the Jewish community because of its association with institutions. If the Jewish community can break away from those institutions and show that it is authentically itself, I think it can win those people over. The danger that the Jewish community faces is in driving those people into the arms of those who suffer from what I call Jewish derangement syndrome. And I think the Wealth Fund is a tactic for being able to achieve a split of those audiences rather than driving them into the hands of those suffering from JDS for short.
Now, Roger, and before I turn to you, just very briefly, to those of you listening in, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there is a Q&A function. And so as Jordan and Roger say things that provoke a question or at least a very strong reaction with a question mark at the end of it, put those questions in that little Q&A box, and I'll try to get to as many as I can in the last 20 minutes of the hour. But Roger, I want to turn to you and your critique of Jordan's proposal. And one point that you make in your response, which I think is an exceptionally important one, is that there is no real analog between, say, the model of the relations of Polish Jewry to the Polish court or Lithuanian Jewry to the duchy, and the American model, where we are, of course, not just Jews, but we are full-fledged American citizens who many of us have risen high, not just in the establishment, but in the anti-establishment. I mean, I can think of, for every establishment Jewish figure, you can think of any number of Abby Hoffmans or Allen Ginsbergs who weren't so establishment. But is your argument, Roger, that the model to which Jordan is looking simply is not applicable given American circumstances? Is that right?
In part, yeah, Brett. I don't think it's the right model, and certainly, I have questions about whether or not the model itself would work in the way that Jordan hopes it would. And I should say at the outset, Brett, thanks for having me on, and it's great to engage with Jordan, who's a good friend, and I also keep it in my talit bag and got fired up reading his article someplace between the 6th and 7th Aliyah of whatever week I was in synagogue reading his work. And, I think the issue kind of that provoked the response was it just seems so un-American. And the experience, the bridge that Jordan was trying to build between, Brett, as you said, the Jewish experience elsewhere and in the United States was not persuasive to me. You go back to Washington's letter to Jews in Newport, Rhode Island. I mean, it's quite clear from the outset that the creedal nation was incorporated Jews from the outset, and that what Washington wanted was, hey, what every other citizen should be doing, which is be good citizens, and that's it, and engaging in all aspects of American life. And we've done that both in the establishment and elite world, and as you know, Brett, elsewhere. So it seemed to be just counter the American Jewish experience. And then the other piece is that even if you want to entertain that there is relevance here, Stadlanut, and the American Jewish experience, it seemed to be sort of the analysis required. The question really I had in mind for Jordan is, how does the state of Israel change that? Because once you have the establishment of the state of Israel, the sovereign, state for the Jewish people is Israel. And that, of course, radically changed the way American Jews live and exist in the United States and Jews across the world. And specifically, as it relates to U.S. security assistance Israel, which was incorporated in Jordan's piece, that is really the domain between two sovereign states as the U.S. government and the government state of Israel. And I don't think any sovereign wealth fund, for that matter, should sort of be assuming that role on behalf of the government state of Israel. So, I think on a number of levels, the sovereign wealth fund didn't seem to me a persuasive way to address many of the ills and important questions that Jordan highlights. I mean, the last one, and I'll pause and turn it back to you, Bret, is that I don't think the sovereign wealth fund construct is a proven tool. I actually think of it as a tool for the weak. I mean, Jordan's article references, the Gulf states. These are states that don't have much to show for anything other than their wealth. They don't share democratic values that we do. They don't share the long history of the American Jewish community has within the United States from its founding. And so if you're weak and all you have is cash, set up a sovereign wealth fund. But I think the American Jewish community is better off double downing on the values that this country was founded on and continue to perpetuate them as Lincoln sought to do with his Lyceum address, and we've done throughout our history.
Roger, let me pursue a few of your points. One in particular, Jordan's essay begins by noting that the golden age of American Jewry is coming to an end, and I suspect you would agree that even on the rosiest view of American life today, let's put it this way: the Mamdani Carlson axis of increasingly prominent voices within the Democratic Party as well as within the Republican Party are something that is new, or at least new to the Jewish experience, or at least new to the Jewish experience in my lifetime and probably the lifetime of our parents. You mentioned the creedal aspect of American identity. But take something like J.D. Vance's speech at the Republican National Convention in 2024, where he talks about the land where he was born, the Kentucky grave in which he plans to die. This is a kind of quite frankly, a blood and soil. I don't mean to suggest the vice president is borrowing Nazi tropes, but it is a classic European blood and soil vision of this country that has never worked particularly well for the Jews. So I guess my question is this: is it your conviction that what Jordan sees as a kind of an end of an era is maybe more of a passing phase? And if it is, or either way, shouldn't it be the smart play for Jews to start adjusting their sails to a new period in which conspiracy theory, old-fashioned anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism, other forces at play are just reshaping the conditions that American Jews have known for at least the last century or so?
So, great question. And I do think, the golden age, which I grew up in, and my father grew up in, coming out of Brooklyn, first generation American, has passed. But I see this as the end of an epoch, not unlike, I was referencing Lincoln's Lyceum speech before. That was he was concerned at the time. He was 28 years old, as you know well, and the founders of the nation had passed, and he was worried about the perpetuation of the institutions that governed our country. And at the time, he was worried about the vigilantism and others, and lawlessness and people taking the law in their own hand. And what he said is that we have to go back into the sober reason and go back to the spirit of the founding, but using as much as our mind, as much as our heart. And I think that is really the construct that I think we ought to draw from. It could be that our institutions are falling short I'm not persuaded that a sovereign wealth fund is the framework that's going to get us to respond to the moment. I mean, you note Tucker, somewhat ironic as we're having this conversation. I think he's still in Qatar, where he's living it up there and said he's going to buy some real estate there, right? So the sovereign wealth fund of Qatar has effectively been able to buy off Tucker Carlson, but I'm not sure they're buying off much more than that. The other point I make is that, our friend Jordan over here, he's sitting in the offices of Palantir Technologies, and they are doing amazing work at countering some of the ills, Bret, that you've articulated. So it's not just Jewish institutions alone that we rely on in this country as American Jews to respond to the ills in this moment. I think we are in a Lyceum moment, and it's going to require a lot of new thinking and new entrants from Alex Karp on down to respond. Joe Lonsdale, someone else I mentioned, who are not coming out of traditional Jewish institutions, but I think are making a meaningful impact. And in part, they're doing so by reminding us about some of these founding principles and what American civic life and is about.
So I imagine Tucker's feeling entirely at home, ideologically speaking.
Bret, there was a heart that just went up on the screen. Just for the record, I want to let everybody know that was not me hearting myself. Although if it was a response to something I said, I'm deeply appreciative.
I'm sure Tucker is feeling right at home in Doha with his new friends, other guests of the Qatari emir, so to speak. Let me ask you, Jordan, this. We have in the United States, as an ethnic community, probably we are more represented by various organizations advancing Jewish interests than any other ethnic group I can think of. I mean, it always astounds me in my 30-year acquaintanceship with the world of Jewish orgs that there's always a new one that I haven't heard of. Your suggestion, however, is that not only are they falling short, but in effect that they've become a part of the problem. And so I guess a couple of questions, which is, to what extent in your view, are those organizations doing more collectively? I'm not talking about any specific organization, but collectively now, in a sense, harming the overall interests of the American Jewish community. And in a scenario where some version of a Jewish sovereign wealth fund comes into being, what is the relationship, in your view, between that fund and this panoply of organizations, which is certainly not going to go away, even if your hopes come true?
Yeah. Well, I think, to state it bluntly at the beginning, setting aside the social services that these institutions provide for, which are vital to the community, on a political level, I think you could do away with most American Jewish institutions and be better off, quite frankly. I think to understand why, you have to take a step back and understand what's happened in American society. And in a post-COVID world, the collapse in trust in institutions accelerated so dramatically. It was already intensifying over the past 30 years. If you look at the Gallup does this poll on trust in institutions, it's basically been like this for a while. But then after COVID and everything that happened, it dropped further. And I think what the Jewish community has done is almost subconsciously feeling that they've grabbed a hold and tried to save these things. And the problem is when you invoke anti-Semitism and call everything anti-Semitic, for example, there's a group of people for whom they're not necessarily anti-Jewish, but when they hear that, the thing they're most interested in is, for example, censorship, and they feel like they're being censored. So I think that's a great example of self-defeating behavior. And what is calling something anti-Semitic? It's an appeal to authority. It's us attempting to call on the institutions, the gatekeepers of yesteryear, and say, this doesn't belong in polite society. It needs to be written out. The Jewish community should be protected. But there's nobody manning those gates anymore. The gates don't even exist. Manhattan Institute put out a poll last week that said 25% of people in the GOP voters under the age of 50 have expressed openly anti-Semitic views. And a fifth of GOP and Democratic voters self-identified as anti-Semitic. That's not just a sea change. I mean, that is happening like a freight train hitting our community, and our institutions are not built to respond at that speed and at that pace. I think that's a huge problem. And you know, in the military, they talk about the OODA loop. This is fitting for Roger being out at the Reagan Defense Forum. The OODA loop, which is about just, you know, the OODA loop is a framework: observe, orient, decide, and act. And the enemies of the Jewish community are inside our OODA loop. Everything we have done from the rise of this movement, whatever you might want to call it, say 2 years ago, roughly speaking, until now, we have been in complete reaction mode. There's not a single moment where I can say the Jewish community has taken the initiative and been out in front. Basically, our entire lives are some mixture of going to Jewish conferences and making each other feel better, listening to our own podcasts and saying, wow, it's great that we know sane people who haven't lost their minds, and getting on WhatsApp groups, as Dan Sinner likes to say, and say, can you believe? Can you believe? And I think our institutions are basically in can you believe it mode. What I tried to do here, whether or not you think it's a good idea, which I happen to think it's a good idea, is push the conversation forward and think of something that can get inside their OODA loop and disrupt them. And what tools do we have to disrupt the OODA loop of these people? And I think this is one of those tools.
But let me just push you on this. There are people who arrive at anti-Semitism through the short route, let's say, and then there's this other group of people who seem to have arrived on a slightly longer journey, which is that they decided that they were anti-institutionalists, and then they presumably observed that Jews are associated with the top rungs of one institution after another, so then they turn to anti-Semitism instead. But the fact is that short route or long route, people have been finding ways to arrive at anti-Semitic conclusions in one society after another from time immemorial. If we were having this conversation 50 or 60 years ago, the anti-Semites would not be accusing us of being too close to the establishment or too associated with the establishment. We would be too associated with the anti-establishment. There were too many Jews involved in the American Communist Party. There were too many Jews who were prominent hippies. There were too many Jews who were at the forefront of the civil rights movement. There were too many Jews who were, affiliated with women's rights or gay rights, or marching with African Americans at Selma and so on. Like, you're. I guess my question for you is, your analysis seems to be that the specific Jewish problem right now is we are too close to the institutions. But in fact, wouldn't we just be substituting one form of anti-Semitism with another by moving away from these institutions? And if so, what is our other defense, if there is any other defense?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it's true that Jews were attacked for being anti-establishment, but they were also attacked for being part of the establishment back then too. So it does go all ways. I think fundamentally that this audience that I'm talking about, what I would call Jewish skeptics who arrive at it by what you say the long road, are still winnable. It is still possible even now for the Jewish community to ensure that those people don't fall into the hands of those suffering from Jewish derangement syndrome. And I think it's key to our survival, not necessarily physically, although possibly, but certainly politically, as a political force in the United States, to ensure that we don't lose that audience. I think that audience spans the political spectrum on the left and on the right. And if we lose those people, we're going to lose 20 to 30 years, because I think we are in a long-term anti-institutional moment. And so it's necessary for our community to pivot and understand where we are. And sometimes you're right, the pivot has to change. Sometimes we have to get more institutionalist. This is one of those moments when we have to go less institutionalist. Why is the wealth fund an answer? Because first of all, it moves with speed, and the speed at which the conversation moves now on social media is staggering. And we continue, sorry to cast aspersions on you, Bret, but I think the community continues to draw on the connections that it knows and is comfortable with. It's op-eds, it's going to the Times or the Wall Street Journal, I'm sorry, I'm done attacking
Publishing long essays in quarterly journals read by influential Jews.
there are people who are engaged in the street warfare, and I'm not sure that we'll ever be very good at that. But one thing I know we are good at is wielding the power that we know how to wield, which in this case is our financial resources, and doing it on behalf of Americans in a way that reaches Americans and speaks to them, which I don't think that the way that we've done it to this point, vis-a-vis NGOs, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I just don't think it meets the moment. I think what Americans need now is something that is much more tangible, and that's what a law fund can provide.
Roger, I see you wanna jump in here, but let me ask you a question, and feel free to add whatever points you wanted to make in answer to Jordan. I think Jordan is absolutely right that something has gone really wrong with the traditional mechanisms by which Jews participate in American life, and that kind of just holding on and hoping for the best or waiting for the storm to pass is probably an insufficient response to what I think is a crisis in the relations between the Jewish community and the United States. I guess two questions. A, do you agree with that diagnosis? And if Jordan's idea for a sovereign wealth fund is mistaken, well, what else? What would you prescribe?
Yeah, it's clearly a crisis, so I can see the point there and agree full-heartedly. I don't see the Jewish community holding on as some sort of, ghettoized entity that, has no strength. Well, let's break this down a little bit. Let me offer perhaps a little more precision. We should not be blaming ourselves for anti-Semitism, and an element, perhaps implicit, though it's not at times explicit on Jordan's part, it suggests that it's our failing or things that we've done wrong that somehow has invited this anti-Semitism. I think that's just wrong. Should our institutions be better at responding, deal with this, and address some of the inadequacies that Jordan has mentioned? Absolutely. We're also not addressing why we're here in part. That's because we're really strong. I believe that we're in this new epoch in part because Jews globally are stronger than they've ever been, and they're primarily made up in North America and in Israel. And because of Israel's strength in particular and its success on the battlefield, we've seen this unbelievable increase in anti-Semitism. So it's a reaction not to weakness, but to Jewish strength. I don't think the institutions have failed entirely. Much of what Jordan was just describing is a difference with how the ADL has operated. He didn't name the ADL, but I'll do it. And I share some of that concern and the overcorrection and sort of the canceling of those that are concerned about free speech and perhaps still will not land in the anti-Semitic camp. But also let's look at what happened when we had the flare up with Vice President Vance speaking in Ole Miss at a Turning Point event, and then shortly after Tucker hosting Fuentes. And then we also had sort of the unbelievable failure on the part of Heritage's leadership, the leader of Heritage, being unable to walk away from his relationship with Tucker, or at least, criticize his anti-Semitism. Like within 48 hours, and perhaps it was what we call mazel in our community, the Republican Jewish Coalition had a very significant event with leading Republicans and others talking and responding to this in a way that I think competed with the speed of the anti-Semites on social media and other fora for getting the response out. Is that a failure of a Jewish institution? Or is the fact that, we always talk about 2 Jews and 3 shuls? I mean, we have like 2 Jews and 15 institutions, to your point earlier, Bret. And they've come out in different ways. And I think that the democratizing of Jewish institutions, the fact that they're on the international level, the national level, the local level, works to our benefit. We had the JCRC in the community I live in not too long ago, and they had the leadership, the elected leadership from Maryland, which at least in the U.S. Congress and the U.S. Senate is not a shining light for love of Israel or American Jews. And well positioned there, working with local leaders to make sure they're countering Chris Van Hollen's, what I think is a anti-Zionist, anti-Israel voice in the U.S. Senate. That is, kind of an establishment Jewish institution that's filling a void that few others could fill. And then you have everybody else, the Ben Shapiros of the world that are going, competing with the Tuckers and calling out the Joe Rogans for platforming haters. So, I see a very rich and dynamic environment. Again, could it be better? Is it responding to the moment? There's definitely concern, and there's a reason why we're feeling unsettled. But it's so much the unique nature of this country, the fact that you don't have a centralized, organized Jewish community like you did in Europe, and certainly the Middle Ages, is working, and ultimately I think will work to our benefit, and that is uniquely American. And so then the last point, a sovereign wealth fund to me suggests sort of solving the problem, and by addressing, I think, a weakness, which is if you centralize things, if you're driving one entity to somehow fix these problems, I think we're going to miss opportunities. Let's trust this republic that's treated us so well and the opportunities it gives us. And I think we'll benefit and win out as we try to drive a new epoch that favors our community.
Right, if you don't mind, I can jump in really fast. What I would say,
go ahead, Jordan.
Yeah, what I would say about the wealth fund is that it's optimistic about the American people. It's pessimistic on the institutions. In my mind, it's actually direct to consumer. It's a way of investing in Americans, and in fact, it's probably the most bullish thing we can do, which is let's put our money in America. Let's put our money in jobs and in helping people find their way in this new AI-ified economy and help the country get ready to compete with all of the rivals that we have around the world. That's how I see it. I don't think it's an abandonment of the, I think, beautiful ode to America that you wrote about, Roger. I'm all for Tocqueville, and I want to see that happen. I actually think the wealth fund is the quicker and better way to get there. We can't wait for I think what's going to be a 20 to 30 year restoration of some of the older institutions. I'm not saying that they're hopeless. I think it's a very long fight, and the community doesn't have the time to wait and for that to correct itself before we lose a lot of political ground. And frankly, as much as I laud the efforts of the people that you just spoke about, that to me is all reactive. And what I'm looking for is something that can help us take the initiative.
Jordan, one of the points that Roger raised in his letter was that, when we were talking about the Stadtland in the era of shtetls and, diaspora European Jewry, it was a world before the state of Israel. The state of Israel is the sovereign Jewish state. Presumably, if it wanted to set up a sovereign wealth fund, it could. Israel's not such a poor country. How does and I want to put this question to Roger also after you answer. How do you see the existence of the state of Israel affecting or not affecting your thinking? I mean, how does that objection factor with you?
Yeah, well, I think there's two things here. There's the Israel piece of this, and there's the American Jewish piece of this. So let me take the first Israel piece of this first. I think that the dependency on Washington has been deleterious to Jerusalem over time, strategically and politically. There was a really harrowing article by Jake Siegel, and I think it was the October issue of Tablet magazine, which talks about the degree to which Israeli strategic culture was affected by American strategic culture over the course of the military aid. And the fact that Israel started to fight like an American force, which it is not an American force. It doesn't have America's strategic posture. And it was an inappropriate way of thinking about Israel's place in the region and how it should fight. It effectively engaged in a Rumsfeldian cutting back on the kind of meat and potatoes of what a military needs to fight in exchange for high-tech and special forces. And we saw the results of that, I think, on October 7th, among many other things. I think that Israel should end that dependency over time, just as it ended the dependency on economic aid. And Bibi himself has acknowledged this, most recently just 2 weeks ago, I think, in an interview, that Israel needs to wean itself off of American military aid and wean itself really off of being a client state and more of a natural and equal partner in the region. I'm not saying that the countries should head for divorce. I think they should have a natural relationship and an equal relationship. I think the aid has affected that. But that's almost less important to me. The more important thing to me is what is the aid doing to the American Jewish community? And I think it's very hard to argue that the aid has not become an albatross around the neck of the American Jewish community. It is $3.8 billion that costs far more politically for us in this country, given the attitude toward foreign aid and military action abroad. To wit, in an August poll that the Free Beacon put out, 44% of young conservatives agreed with the statement that ending U.S. military aid to Israel would make me feel better about the U.S.-Israel relationship. I think it would speak volumes to Americans if the Jewish community stepped up and took some of the burden off of the taxpayer there, a burden that honestly could be well filled if American Jews invested in defense technologies in Israel that are good for both countries, by the way, because the United States can benefit from those technologies as well. But the deeper psychological point here is that I think American Jews need to affect some sort of almost American Jewish Zionism here. They need to act with agency. And the Wealth Fund is a way for them to act with agency. It's not to break away from Israel. It's not to undermine Israeli sovereignty. It is to establish a distinct identity that they can be a power in the United States and affect how the United States does business and how the U.S.-Israel relationship does business different from in the past.
Roger, this was a major point in your article. What's your feeling of Israel and our relationship with it, and whether it's an albatross around our neck or not?
Yeah, I don't think it's an albatross around our neck. I actually approach the challenge that Jordan's articulated quite differently. So let me jump into a couple of the particulars. I don't think the issue here is the aid, or somehow if we remove $3.8 billion off the balance sheet, then the demographic that Jordan's described somehow will embrace Israel. I think what we need to do is explain the value proposition, the return on investment for that aid. Operation Midnight Hammer, without question, validated the $3.8 billion for the United States. That was a huge return on investment. We just came from the Reagan National Defense Forum, where we heard Secretary of War Pete Hegseth emphasize the sort of ally that the United States will invest in and continue to support. And Israel is the model, because it took out one of the principal adversaries, not just facing Israel, but the United States. Now, if the sovereign government of Israel feels that they don't need that direct financing, of course, we know almost 90% of it is spent in the United States. That $3.8 billion is going back into the U.S. economy. But even set that aside, so be it. I think what's driven the problems that we're seeing, certainly on the left, to the extent that it's our actions that are driving part of this anti-Zionism, which again, I'm somewhat skeptical of, is I think that Israeli governments have overplayed their hand in American politics. In other words, the problem isn't that the security assistance numbers are too high. The problem is perhaps that our leadership the state of Israel's leadership has become too partisan, right? Going in and speaking before the House of Representatives and the Senate without the sanction or agreement of the President of the United States. I mean, these are things that have actually actions taken on behalf by leaders in Israel, in this case, the Netanyahu government, that really made Israel a partisan issue in the halls of the U.S. Congress, and I think across the country. So, overall, I think that if you want to change Israel's behavior, I think they need to do a better job playing American politics. I don't think changing the amount of aid is going to do it. Last point on security, and here you get a little bit on the hubris side on the part of our Israeli brothers here, which is if they think for a second that they don't need the United States, that the strength of the U.S. is something Israel somehow could be the Spartan nation and live on its own, that they're tragically mistaken. The sovereignty of Israel, the security of Israel, really rests deeply on not only the political relationship between the government of Israel and the United States, but that security relationship. And if Israel thinks they can go on their own, they are going to be very vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean,
Roger, Jordan, hang on a second. I know you want to respond, Jordan, but I want to give our audience time to ask their own questions, and simply because this person's surname is so apropos and so terrific, I want to give the first question to Raviv Sapir, who asks, he says, super interesting proposal, Jordan. How do you think you will persuade the average Jewish American philanthropist to donate to Jewish causes rather than to established institutions like hospitals, universities, etc.?
Well, I don't have to convince them all, and I don't expect that all of them would be convinced. But I think the quote unquote beauty of the proposal that I've come up with is that we don't need the buy-in of the entire community. We've operated for all the diversity. We do operate within a kind of band of consensus. There's organizations that can keep everything on the rails, and I think all it takes is a group of 5 to 10 investors to go and make a very big difference on this front. So hopefully 5 to 10 of those people will emerge maybe from this debate or something else, but I don't think it would require a vast consensus among all Jewish philanthropists.
This is a question from Matthew Schwaber. I hope, Matthew, I haven't messed up your surname. Matthew asks, according to the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism, the Qatar Foundation has injected $20 billion into American universities and K-12 programs in order to turn Americans against Israel and to promote Muslim Brotherhood ideology in the guise of social justice. Roger, if you, Roger, oppose the idea of a Jewish Sovereign Wealth Fund, what do you propose as a means to combat Qatari spending and influence?
So, great question. Clarify a point. I don't view the Jewish Sovereign Wealth Fund as an adequate replacement for institutions that Jordan critiques. I'm totally fine with this being an or, right? Or an and, excuse me. We're gonna go ahead and have our Jewish institutions and throw in a sovereign wealth fund. In some respects, I mean, Jordan's quite familiar with the Paul Singer Foundation. I mean, they're doing a lot of this stuff, and particularly as it relates to educational institutions, bringing people along and countering some of this toxicity coming from Qatar. But even more important, Bret, what's been the response to date to this Muslim Brotherhood driven funding from Qatar? It's been our states, the great laboratory of states that this amazing republic organized at its founding. Florida, Texas, North Carolina. These institutions are investing in their universities, state funding universities, right, to bring in classically liberal faculty to teach American civics. And I think it's going to have a meaningful impact influence. I mean, why is Jordan is citing Manhattan Institute surveys? Let's highlight another Manhattan Institute a product. They rated the top university in the universities in the United States. University of Florida, #1. University of Texas, #2, outperforming institutions that usually were there, Harvard and other Ivy League schools. Why? Because they're grading them on free speech. They're grading them on the ability to actually get a job afterwards or have a degree that's meaningful beyond some narrow abstraction and multiculturalism that not adding to the economy, not doing anything with productivity, and only planting the seeds for a generation of anti-Semites. The states are responding in a very meaningful way, and I think that is as much reflecting of the promise of our republic, and this is where individual Jews and Jewish institutions or hedge fund billionaires or a sovereign wealth fund can support. But we're getting some of the responses that are making our country and our next generation more healthy, and it's disrupting these traditional institutions that have failed us.
George Asimov, another surname I like, asks, I guess this is a question for Jordan. I'm curious about strategic philanthropy as a path forward for elevating Jewish values like tikkun olam while addressing anti-Semitism. What if we focused on investing in Israeli innovation and fostering cross-border collaboration on global challenges like climate change? Could supporting Israeli tech leadership and creating partnerships that solve universal problems be a more compelling counter-narrative to anti-Semitism than traditional advocacy alone? What do you think of that, Jordan?
I think the answer is no. I think we've been trying that for 30 years. There are any number of initiatives out there that try to leverage Israeli know-how and technological wonder to make the case for, quite frankly, Jewish usefulness in the world. And I don't think that it has made a dent. In fact, just look at the way the numbers have gone. It's clearly not arresting the trend line that we seem to all agree on as far as the spread of anti-Semitism. American Jews have to stand on their own. That's what I mean by when I talk about American Jewish emancipation. We can't rely on the Silicon Valley and Tel Aviv to make the case for us. We have to show that we are contributing members of this country, that we're not relying on people from across the ocean to make the case for ourselves here. So I don't think that's going to cut it, is my answer.
Okay, for some reason, this is purely fortuitous, but there's a theme in that we have many people in our audience with fabulous last names with a certain literary resonance. So Shiran Pasternak wants to know, this is a question for Roger. The golden age of American Jewry was defined by a large Jewish immigration in response to anti-Semitism starting in the late 19th century. But today we are facing major headwinds, whether it's the time that has lapsed since World War II, the rise of anti-Semitism on both the left and the right, the lagging American Jewish birth rate, 1.9 children per adult versus 2.3 for the general U.S. population. Not quite sure those statistics are right, but there's something there. How much can we count on Jewish representation in the halls of power within 2 generations? Can we count on there being more Louis Brandeises, Henry Kissingers, or even Chuck Schumers? Can we continue to count on the grace of allies like Christian Zionists? Roger, what do you say to Boris Pasternak's namesake?
I think we can. And I believe that, I mean, listen, we are, our strength as a Jewish community in America is not our numbers. It never has been, and it won't be. So the demographics are what they are, and yet this amazing republic has given Jews like you, Bret, a great opportunity to be a leading voice in our national conversation, and someone like Jordan to be a counselor to a leading technology company in our country, one of the most dynamic technology companies we have today. And I think that's going to continue to play out in big ways, institutional ways, and at the individual level. The one demographic concern, since that came up in the question that I had, that I have in my mind, is that, listen, if you look at Europe and you see what's happening to the Jewish communities there and the rise of anti-Semitism there, demographics is a big part of why those governments have turned on the state of Israel. You think Australia and the United Kingdom and France, in terms of recognizing a Palestinian state in the moment that there was a post October 7th, after Hamas carried out its violent attack on Israel. You can't understand that without looking at the demographics of Muslim populations in those countries. So if I think about the promise for the United States in the future, we have to look at how big the Jewish community is relative to the Muslim population. I think that is something we need to keep an eye on. But even with that, I do think there is something exceptional about this country, and that is probably, well, is in my judgment, why we will always be better off.
Jordan, this is a question from Adam Weezer. And I think I know the answer, but you should spell it out. Is the sovereign wealth fund meant to supplant or to augment the existing funding mechanisms within our Jewish communities? Adam adds, my family donates money to the Columbus, Ohio Jewish Foundation, good for you and your family, to support Jewish communal activities, education, JCC, security, etc. So can you clarify your argument to Adam?
Yeah, it's to augment. It's not to do away with, especially all of those kinds of things, Jewish education, Jewish social services. In no way would a wealth fund be able to or should aim to replace those things. But I do think it can take moonshot bets that the establishment Jewish institutions can take, and it can invest real money, which is I think the big difference. I think that's in a transactional world, that's what talks more. By the way, it's a different context, but it was reported over the weekend that Jared Kushner has been encouraging Bibi to develop economic diplomatic muscle and get involved in the private sector. He said that when the Gulf states arrive in Washington, they bring business delegations because they want to do deals. I think that's the Israeli context, but the American Jewish community has to develop that muscle. I think it goes back to the beginning of our discussion. We've shied away from that because it seemed unseemly and somewhat garish to spend in the way that the Gulf states spend money. It was a little too obvious and on the nose. I think we have to get over the sort of country club mentality that we should hide a little bit behind our institutions and donate to things that seem a little less or a little more seemly and proper. We need to get in the mix, and we need to. I don't think that it's nice to think that the Qataris or the Saudis or the Bahrainis are displaying weakness when they leverage their sovereign wealth funds the way they have. I wish that were the case. I don't think that's true anymore.
Ozzie Jacobson has a question for you, Roger, but first he has a comment, which is that you're wearing a wonderful tie. But he adds, besides the sartorial compliment, he says you mentioned that Israel is almost wholly dependent on the U.S., but where does that reliance actually end? What happens 10 or 20 years down the line if the political environment in Washington shifts? And then he adds one more point. If we don't start gradually reducing that dependency, for example, through something like a wealth fund, are we not increasing our long-term strategic risk? How do you answer Ozzie?
Well, Ozzie's got a great eye for style, first of all. And that is a great question. I think he was asking about an Israeli sovereign wealth fund, perhaps what Jordan was just referencing. Of course, Jordan's argument is about a Jewish sovereign wealth fund that would be centered in the United States. But on the Israeli side of the ledger, listen, we need to come to terms with what Israel is and is not. It's a remarkable country, a miracle, economic miracle, technological miracle. It is punching above its weight, and it's remarkable what it's achieved and what it continues to achieve. And part of why it's able to achieve that is this amazing relationship it has with the United States, built on not just the fact that it has great technology, but the values that underride it, which, of course, is not true for the Qatars of the world or the Saudis of the world or the Jordanians, Egyptians of the world, because they are not democratic states, right? And they don't have the shared values between societies. And at the same time, Israel has to recognize it's a vassal state. It, just like the first Commonwealth in Jewish history or the second Commonwealth, it is a vassal state. It has to manage itself amongst the great powers of the world. That's not an insult to Israel. That is many countries in the world, certainly of the size of Israel. And so going off and being independent is there's risk there. Now, to be a better partner, and I've seen in my lifetime, Israel become a much better partner, most familiar in the security realm, where it's no longer just the United States giving its weapons and capability to Israel, but the United States benefits from what Israel can give in that relationship. It's not transactional. It's a true partnership. And we saw that play out certainly after October 7th. And I hit on some of those points before. So deepening the relationship, strengthening the relationship. If Israel wants to go ahead, as Jordan proposes, to have some sort of make investments in the United States, quite interesting. We'll see if that, what would add to the relationship. But as I tried to articulate before, Israel's a fantastic partner. Now, one last point, Qatar and the Saudis and Bahrain as well, they're using their sovereign wealth funds to offer the United States value in exchange for U.S. troops in their territory. The Fifth Fleet benefits, Bahrain wants the Fifth Fleet there. Al Udeid and Qatar, they like having the security, the collective security guarantee that Donald Trump gave them. So it is, they're getting something in return for sure, far more transactional than I think the United States and Israeli relationship is.
Final question here, because we're running out of time, is from an anonymous person. It's for you, Jordan. Does a Jewish sovereign wealth fund not make you nervous about further alienating Israel from the world? Inevitably, it would make the Jews separate themselves more and more from America, naturally affecting Israel. Whether we like it or not, America is essential to the survival of Israel as it stands now, going to some of what Roger just said. So does it alarm you, or how do you answer our reader here?
No, to go back to what I said, I think a American Jewish wealth fund that invests in America is a bet on America. It's not an attempt to alienate. I think it is a reaction to the fact that America is more tribal than it has been in the past. That is uncomfortable for Jews and the Jewish community here. We have thrived in a very liberal, a liberal environment in which tribalism was attenuated. And now tribalism has made a return. There's all sorts of reasons and causes for that we could spend another hour talking about. But I think we have to react to that in a way that nevertheless doubles down on the American promise, that believes in the dynamic in this country. And I think Roger and I, here's something we can agree on to finish the debate. In our different ways, I do think we believe in the future of this country. I don't know that it's going to correct itself in the time that we need in order for us to just do the same thing. I'm not saying Roger's saying we should do the same thing, but I do think that if we take action and as a community and we adopt an approach of agency and we fight for ourselves, self-reliance is the most American thing since sliced bread. So I think that's why the Wealth Fund will actually help us, not harm us, and it will not. I know that there are going to be people who always hate us. There's nothing we can do about that. But I do think we can win over people who are skeptical of us right now. And I think that will help secure our place in the American future.
Jordan, Roger, I really want to thank you for a really first-rate conversation. This is exactly the kind of debate or conversation that SAPIR was designed to host from the very beginning. And it's just a joy to be able to host this. I do not know what to think, but I think I'm thinking a little more sharply than I did before, thanks to the two of you. Enjoy the rest of the day. And again, a real pleasure having you in this conversation.
Thank you, Bret.
Thank you,
and thanks
Bret.
for joining.
Bye-bye.